Then it really hit me. I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all.
For more than 50 years, we've been told a simple story. We went to the moon. We planted a flag. We proved it could be done. And then we stopped. Officially, it was budget cuts, politics, shifting priorities. But what if that's only part of the story? What if the reason we never returned wasn't about money, or technology, or public interest? What if something happened up there, something documented, reported, and quietly set aside? Tonight we're looking at the testimony of a man who doesn't deal in fantasy, a decorated Air Force Brigadier General, one of only 12 humans to ever stand on another world, a man whose voice guided the first moon landing in human history. 3 years after that historic moment, he walked on the lunar surface himself. And during that mission, in a remote stretch of the highlands far from the landing module, something appeared on the horizon that didn't fit the textbooks. Edges where there should have been randomness, geometry where there should have been chaos. A silence from mission control that felt different. He followed orders. He moved on. And for decades, he said nothing. Now, in the final chapter of his life, he's asking a question that changes everything. Did we stop going back because we ran out of resources? Or because we found something we weren't prepared to understand? Stay with me. Because the deeper we go into the Apollo missions, the stranger the unanswered details become. And if you're new here, subscribe now, because this story is only the beginning, and we're just getting started. For most of us, the story of the moon feels complete. In July 1969, Apollo 11 carried human beings across 250,000 miles of empty space. The world watched as Neil Armstrong stepped down onto the surface and said words that would echo through history. It felt like the beginning of something. Over the next few years, mission after mission followed. 12 men walked on the lunar surface. Rovers moved carefully across ancient plains. Experiments were placed into the gray dust. Rock samples were sealed and returned to Earth. Then, quietly, it ended. In December 1972, Apollo 17 lifted off from the moon. The ascent stage disappeared into the black sky. And without ceremony, humanity's visits to another world came to a close. The official reasons were practical. Budgets tightened. Public excitement faded after the first landing. The Vietnam War demanded national focus. Political priorities shifted. The space program evolved toward different goals. All of that is true, but here is where the story begins to feel unfinished. When something represents the greatest leap in exploration in human history, you don't simply walk away from it indefinitely. Not without a deeper shift. Not without a reason that goes beyond spreadsheets and headlines. The technology existed. The infrastructure was in place. The Saturn rockets were operational. Astronaut training pipelines were active. Studies for extended lunar stays, even long-term bases, were already being examined. And yet, within a few years, the momentum dissolved. The question isn't whether the official reasons were real. The question is whether they were complete. History shows us something interesting. When exploration reveals nothing unexpected, curiosity grows. Investment expands. The frontier becomes magnetic. But when exploration raises difficult questions, questions without immediate answers, institutions tend to slow down. They reassess. They become cautious. So before we talk about anomalies, before we talk about strange observations, before we talk about anything controversial at all, we begin with a simple question. Why did the most ambitious exploration program ever attempted come to such a sudden halt? And why did it take nearly 50 years for humanity to seriously consider returning? That question doesn't require speculation. It only requires curiosity. And to explore it, we need to understand one of the men who was there, not during the first step, but during one of the final missions. A man known for precision, discipline, and composure. A man who would later say that some of what he saw never made it into the official reports. And that is where our story begins to shift. His name is Charles Duke. Before he ever set foot on the moon, Duke was already trusted with one of the most delicate responsibilities in human history. In July 1969, during Apollo 11, it was his voice that echoed through the headset of Neil Armstrong as the lunar module descended toward the Sea of Tranquility. When Armstrong's fuel ran low, when alarms flashed inside the cockpit, when the entire world held its breath, Duke remained steady, calm, measured, precise. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't theatrical. He spoke in clipped, technical language, the kind that comes from years of discipline. An Air Force test pilot, an engineer, a man trained to remove emotion from crisis. NASA selected astronauts from thousands of candidates. They were not chosen for imagination. They were chosen for composure under extreme pressure, for attention to detail, for their ability to observe and report without exaggeration. Duke embodied that mindset. In 1972, 3 years after guiding humanity's first landing, he climbed into a Saturn V rocket himself as part of Apollo 16. This time, he wasn't behind a console in Houston. He was inside the spacecraft. He would become the 10th human being to walk on the lunar surface. By the time Apollo 16 launched, the program was no longer about proving we could land. That had already been accomplished. The focus had shifted to science, deeper geological study, longer surface stays, more ambitious exploration using the lunar rover. Their landing site was the Descartes Highlands, a rugged ancient region far removed from the smoother plains visited by earlier crews. Scientists believed the area might hold clues about the moon's volcanic past. The mission profile was methodical, structured, predictable, 71 hours on the surface, multiple EVAs, systematic sample collection. Nothing in the training manuals suggested anything beyond geology. Nothing in the briefings hinted at surprises. And that is what makes what happened next so unsettling. Because when someone with Duke's background pauses before choosing his words, when someone trained to observe without embellishment says certain details were never included in official summaries, it carries weight. Not because it proves anything, but because of who is saying it. Duke was not known for speculation. He built his reputation on clarity, on facts, on staying within the boundaries of what could be measured, which is why, decades later, when he began speaking carefully about moments during that mission that felt different, people listened. He didn't describe monsters. He didn't describe cinematic encounters. He described inconsistencies. Small things at first, details that didn't align perfectly with expectations. And sometimes the smallest details are the ones that stay with you the longest. Before we move into those moments, before we talk about unusual observations or strange impressions, it's important to understand something about the moon itself. It is silent, completely silent. There is no air to carry sound, no wind to shift dust, no clouds to scatter light. It is a place defined by stillness, which is why, when something interrupts that stillness, even subtly, it stands out. And for Charles Duke, somewhere in that vast gray landscape, something did. Quietly, subtly. Enough to remember it for the rest of his life. And that's where the anomalies begin. Apollo 16 touched down in April of 1972. The lunar module settled into the Descartes Highlands, a landscape older than the seas visited by earlier crews. This wasn't the smooth, dark basalt of the equatorial plains. This was rugged terrain, bright, elevated, scarred by ancient impacts. To the astronauts, it looked frozen in time. Charles Duke and his commander, John Young, stepped onto the surface with a clear checklist. Their mission under Apollo 16 was precise. Study highland geology, deploy experiments, drive the lunar rover across terrain no human had ever seen. Everything was scheduled, every movement tracked, every minute accounted for, every observation transmitted back to NASA in Houston. The first EVA unfolded as expected. The rover performed well. The dust behaved the way lunar dust always does, fine as powder, clinging to everything. The horizon curved sharply against a pitch-black sky. But somewhere during those long hours outside the module, small details began to feel unusual, not dramatic, not cinematic, just slightly out of place. Duke would later describe moments where the light didn't appear entirely consistent. On the moon, sunlight should be stark and unfiltered. With no atmosphere, there's no diffusion. Shadows are sharp, contrast is extreme, and yet at times he noticed subtle variations. Faint shifts in tone near the horizon, hints of color where there should have been only silver-gray brightness. He would glance away, look back. The landscape remained unchanged. It wasn't constant, it wasn't overwhelming, just enough to register. Then there was the stillness. Astronauts train extensively for isolation, but the lunar surface introduces something deeper than quiet. There is no ambient noise, no rustle of wind, no distant hum of life. The only sounds come through the suite: breathing, mechanical systems, radio chatter. Inside that silence, perception becomes heightened. Duke mentioned moments where he became acutely aware of his own heartbeat inside the helmet, of the rhythm of oxygen cycling through the system, of the vast emptiness stretching in every direction. And occasionally he described an impression, difficult to articulate, that the environment felt less empty than it appeared. Not movement, not visible activity, just a sensation of awareness. He later said, "It wasn't fear, it wasn't panic. It was more like standing in a vast ancient cathedral and realizing how small you are within it." John Young, known for his dry wit and unshakable calm, reportedly acknowledged similar moments of disorientation, subtle distortions in how long tasks felt versus what their timers indicated. A sample collection that seemed to take minutes would register far longer on the mission clock. Other tasks would feel extended, yet barely any time had passed. Now, fatigue can affect perception. So can adrenaline. Astronauts are trained to account for that, and that is why these details are intriguing. Not because they prove anything, but because they came from men trained to notice discrepancies. Still, none of this was alarming. Not yet. The mission continued. Samples were gathered. Photographs were taken. Rover tracks carved temporary lines across terrain untouched for billions of years. But on the far side of one particular ridge, several kilometers from the lunar module, something shifted from subtle to undeniable. Until that moment, the anomalies were impressions. After that moment, they were observations. And that is where this story changes tone. It happened several kilometers from the lunar module. By that point, Charles Duke and John Young had grown comfortable with the rhythm of movement on the moon. The rover hummed beneath them. Dust lifted in slow arcs and fell without sound. The horizon remained razor-sharp against the black sky. Out there, the Earth wasn't even visible, just gray terrain stretching outward in every direction, untouched, ancient, indifferent. They crested a gentle rise. And that's when Duke noticed it. At first, it didn't register as anything specific, just a subtle interruption in the pattern of randomness that defines the lunar surface. Craters overlap chaotically, boulders scatter without symmetry. Everything on the moon is the result of impact and time. But this shape didn't follow that pattern. There were edges, not jagged fractures, not broken rock faces, edges that appeared linear. Duke slowed. Young adjusted their direction slightly, angling the rover to get a clearer view. Neither of them rushed. On the moon, you never rush. Movements are deliberate, controlled. As they drew closer, the outline became more distinct. The form seemed partially embedded in the regolith, as though only a portion of it was exposed. The visible section appeared elongated, not circular like a crater rim, not irregular like shattered debris. It suggested alignment, and alignment is rare in a landscape shaped almost entirely by random impact. Duke would later describe the moment not as shock, but as recognition. The quiet realization that what he was looking at did not immediately fit into the mental categories he had prepared for. He called it out over the open channel. His tone, as always, was measured, observational, technical, Houston acknowledged. But there was a pause. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just slightly longer than the familiar cadence of space-to-ground communication, the kind of delay that makes you instinctively glance at your partner. Young saw it too. They repositioned the rover for a different angle. From that vantage point, the geometry appeared more defined, sections that seemed almost rectangular in proportion. The surface was coated in lunar dust, softening its contours, but the underlying lines remained perceptible. Was it a natural rock formation fractured along uncommon fault lines? Possibly. The moon has surprised geologists before, but in that moment, standing in a place no human had ever examined, the impression was difficult to dismiss. The shape held a suggestion of structure, not overt, not dramatic, but enough to linger in the mind. Duke described the silence inside his helmet as heavier than before, not because of fear, because of uncertainty. He requested guidance. The response, when it came, was brief. Continue with planned activities, maintain schedule, and so they did. That is what astronauts do. They moved on. But before leaving the area, Duke raised his camera and captured images, wide shots for context, closer frames for detail. Documentation is instinct. If something raises a question, you record it. The rover tracks eventually curved away from the ridge. The shape receded into the distance, blending once again into the vast gray terrain. From orbit, from Earth, from history, nothing in the official summaries would single out that moment as unusual. Just another EVA, another geological survey, another data point. And yet for Duke, that horizon never entirely left him. Because sometimes it isn't what you see clearly that stays with you. It's what you almost understand. And that quiet uncertainty would follow him long after the mission ended. Astronauts are trained to trust documentation. Memory can shift over time. Impressions can blur. But photographs freeze a moment exactly as it was. Before leaving the ridge, Charles Duke lifted his Hasselblad camera and did what he had done hundreds of times during the mission. He framed the horizon carefully. He adjusted his position slightly to account for the harsh contrast of lunar light. He pressed the shutter, once, then again. Wide angles, context shots, closer views. Each frame captured on film, sealed inside a magazine that would later return to Earth aboard Apollo 16. At the time, there was no dramatic reaction, no heated exchange over the radio. The instruction from NASA had been calm and procedural, continue with planned activities. And they did. The EVA concluded, the samples were cataloged, the rover parked. The ascent stage eventually lifted off, leaving the Descartes highlands silent once more. Back on Earth, as with every Apollo mission, the photographs were processed, archived, and integrated into mission records. Thousands of images were cataloged from Apollo 16 alone. Landscapes, equipment, geological formations. Nothing in the official summaries highlighted a geometric anomaly. Nothing singled out a structure. Years passed. The Apollo era faded into history. Focus shifted toward low Earth orbit, toward the shuttle program, toward different frontiers. But Duke remembered that ridge. And decades later, when interviews began revisiting the Apollo missions in greater detail, he spoke carefully about moments that felt incomplete in the public record. He didn't claim definitive conclusions. He didn't insist on extraordinary interpretations. He simply noted that some observations never seemed to receive follow-up attention. That certain images he distinctly remembered capturing were difficult to locate in public archives. Now, archival systems are complex. Film can degrade. Cataloging errors can happen. Tens of thousands of frames were processed during Apollo. But when someone who physically pressed the shutter recalls specific images, remembers the angle, the framing, the context, and then cannot easily reconcile that memory with what's available publicly, it creates a quiet tension, not accusation, just question. Duke has said in measured interviews that he believes not every detail from those missions was explored as deeply as it could have been, that certain data points were simply folded into the larger archive without extended analysis. Again, not secrecy in the cinematic sense, more like institutional narrowing of focus. If a photograph doesn't fit the primary geological objective, it may not receive extended attention. It becomes one frame among thousands. But here's where the question grows interesting. If what they observed was entirely ordinary, a natural rock formation easily explained, why does the memory remain so vivid? Why revisit it at all? Astronauts experienced countless unusual-looking rock formations during Apollo. Most faded into technical footnotes. Yet this one stayed, and memory, especially for disciplined observers, tends to anchor around moments that resist easy categorization. The photographs exist somewhere in the vast Apollo archive. Whether interpreted as mundane geology or something more ambiguous depends on who examines them and how. But the ridge itself is still there, untouched, unvisited since 1972, waiting perhaps for another set of eyes to examine it with modern tools. Because the real weight of the story isn't just about a photograph. It's about what happens when a question lingers for half a century without a return trip to verify it. And that is where the story begins to widen, beyond one mission, beyond one astronaut, toward a pattern that some believe extends across multiple crews. One account on its own can be dismissed. Space is disorienting. Memory evolves. Human perception is never perfect. But when similar undercurrents appear across different missions, across different personalities, the conversation becomes more nuanced. The Apollo program placed 12 human beings on the lunar surface between 1969 and 1972. 12 individuals, different backgrounds, different temperaments, different missions. And yet, in later interviews, subtle threads begin to surface. Not dramatic claims, not coordinated statements, just moments, small remarks that hint at experiences not fully captured in official summaries. Take Buzz Aldrin, the second human to walk on the moon during Apollo 11. In later years, he spoke publicly about unusual objects observed during spaceflight, carefully clarifying that some were likely debris or natural phenomena. Still, his comments carried a tone of curiosity rather than dismissal. He encouraged continued investigation of anomalies wherever they appear. Then there was Edgar Mitchell. After returning from Apollo 14, Mitchell became more open about his belief that the universe may hold intelligent life beyond Earth. He didn't claim to have seen structures on the moon. He didn't present classified evidence. But he consistently suggested that humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos might be incomplete. And Alfred Worden, who orbited above the lunar surface during Apollo 15, spoke thoughtfully about the possibility that life in the universe could be more interconnected than we assume. His reflections were philosophical, not sensational, yet they contributed to a broader sense that the moon experience altered perspectives in lasting ways. It's important to be clear, none of these astronauts collectively announced a hidden discovery. There was no unified declaration, no coordinated narrative. What exists instead is something quieter, a pattern of openness, a pattern of acknowledging that the lunar missions were more complex psychologically and philosophically than the simplified public story suggests. Many astronauts have described the overview effect, the profound cognitive shift that occurs when viewing Earth from space. A realization of fragility, of interconnectedness, of scale. But some descriptions go further. They speak of the moon not as a lifeless rock, but as a place that feels ancient in a way that is difficult to articulate, a place that evokes questions rather than answers. When these reflections are placed side by side, they don't prove a hidden structure or a suppressed photograph. What they suggest is something subtler. The moon experience left unresolved questions in the minds of the very people we trust most to describe it. And when multiple disciplined observers independently express that sense of incompleteness, that feeling that not everything fit neatly into the official narrative, it invites a deeper look, not into conspiracy, into context. Because sometimes patterns don't emerge from what is loudly declared. They emerge from what is gently repeated over decades, and that leads us to the most important question of all. If there was nothing beyond routine geology, If every anomaly was easily explained, why did the sense of unfinished business linger among those who were there? That question doesn't accuse. It simply asks us to look a little closer. And as we do, the story moves toward its most uncomfortable possibility. Not that something dramatic was hidden, but that something complicated was left unexplored.